Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, a window into the soul of the North Fork of Long Island. We'll delve into the pulse of our community, its pressing issues, promising opportunities, and the rich stories that weave our shared history. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 82, we sit down with Troy Gustavson, former owner of the Times Review Media Group, for a deep dive into his fascinating journey from his roots in New Jersey and an early passion for journalism to his college years at the University of Pennsylvania. Troy shares how his career took shape. He reflects on his time in politics, his eventual return to journalism, and the pivotal moment in 1977 when he purchased the Suffolk Times. Join us as Troy recounts the challenges of running a local newspaper, the growth from its Greenport origins to a new headquarters in Mattituck, and some of the memorable stories of his career. He also shares his perspective on the evolving world of journalism and his hopes for the future of both the paper and the North Fork. So I hope you enjoy episode 82 with Troy Gustavson. This episode was recorded July 16th, 2024. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I'm pleased to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. And to start off, could you give us a brief introduction about yourself, where you were born and raised?
I was born in Englewood, New Jersey, 1946, a long time ago. And my family moved to a neighboring town, Hackensack, where I lived until I went off to college. And spent 18 years there pretty much in Hackensack. It's about 8 miles from the George Washington Bridge on the New Jersey side, so it's suburban New Jersey. But I had I'd say a normal childhood there.
And in terms of your ancestry, how far back can you go on either your mother's or father's side?
I feel more comfortable on my father's side because his mother, my grandmother, lived to be 102, and I was responsible for her for about the last 20 years of her life. So we had a lot of interaction. So my best awareness is of her father, Sven Pettersson, who owned a sawmill in a town called Charlottenberg in Sweden. And that's where my grandmother grew up and came to this country, I think about 1908, and moved to Montana. There she met my grandfather, who was also Swedish, who had preceded her there. From there, they moved to San Francisco, where he was a member of the Revenue Service, which was the forerunner to the Coast Guard. And he basically guarded the coast all the way up into Alaska. My father was born there in 1915, and the family immediately returned to Sweden, where he grew up to, I think, probably about age 12 or so, when his family moved back to northern New Jersey. It was while he was in the service that he met my mother, and I was born a couple years after that.
And you're saying your grandma came over from Sweden?
From Sweden in 1908. By herself, she was, I think, like 12 years old or 13, something very young. Her sister was living in Montana. That's where she went, and that's where she met my grandfather.
Well, did she ever tell you why she came over or after?
I think there was a famine. Apparently, a lot of people left Sweden during those years. I was able actually to go to the Emigrants Museum in Sweden, and I found her signature on a logbook. She went to the U.S. on the Lusitania before it sunk, of course. uh, and she went from New York to Montana, where she met my grandfather. So it's that side of the family that I'm more familiar with. My mother grew up in Rensselaer County, New York, near Troy, New York, which is where I got my name, Troy. And she was an RN, a nurse, who joined the Army in World War II, and she and my father met in North Africa, and they were married in Oran, Algeria in 1944, 2 years before I was born back in New Jersey.
And what was your dad doing? Was that for World War II?
Well, he was in the Army as a supply sergeant. My mother was a registered nurse. She actually outranked him. And if they wanted to date or see each other, apparently it got pretty complicated where they had to get permission from a superior officer even to meet. But eventually they got permission to marry. So that was a unique situation at the time.
Yeah. And they came back together after the war?
Yeah. And again, I was born 2 years later in 46. I'm pretty sure their marriage was in 44. And we led a fairly normal life in Hackensack. My mother was a public health nurse by that time. My father, who had retired from working with Marvel comic books, he actually did the lettering for a lot of their early publications. Not the drawings themselves, but the little voice box over the head of the person who was speaking. But that was before the war. When he got back, he took over his father's business, which was a painting contractor in Bergen County, New Jersey. And that's what they did for all the years that I lived with them before I went off to college.
And you mentioned that it was a pretty normal childhood in Hackensack. How would you describe the neighborhood or community you grew up in?
Yeah, it was a middle-class community. We lived on a dead-end street, Coolidge Place. And actually, I wanted to tell you about Coolidge Place because you're going to ask me, I think, how I got involved as a journalist. And I don't know how this happened, but when I was about 8 years old, I established the Coolidge Place Gazette, which was a newspaper. And I used to print a little newspaper on a little handheld printing press that I had and delivered it to my neighbors. So I guess very early on, that was a career I was interested in. But I'd say it was a fairly normal childhood. It was unique from my perspective in that I was an only child, so I had no brothers and sisters. But therefore, I had a lot of friends, and throughout my life, I've tried to cultivate those friendships. I was a pretty good student in high school, not the best, but certainly not the worst. And I had the good fortune of playing on a state championship football team. And when the college recruiters came, they found out that most of the guys on the team really were not that strong academically. I was perhaps the strongest, and therefore I was recruited by a couple of the Ivy League colleges and a couple of other places. And eventually I went off to the University of Pennsylvania as a freshman.
But say within high school, what were you interested in subject-wise?
Again, journalism. I was editor of both the high school newspaper and the yearbook. It seems to me, as far as careers are concerned, that's all I was ever interested in. I was also very fortunate to live in a town, Hackensack, that had a daily newspaper, the Bergen Record. And I got a job there as a copy boy when I was about 14 years old. So I was getting paid to be a quasi-journalist. I basically, filled the coffee cups and returned the phone calls that they didn't want to take. But it was a great experience. I mean, from the age of probably 14 until I went off to college at 18, I actually worked on what was for that area a major daily newspaper. So my career in journalism basically began then, if not with the Coolidge Place Gazette 10 years before that.
Yeah. And so at UPenn, was your bachelor's in journalism?
Well, actually, they changed signals on me. When I was accepted to go into the journalism curriculum undergraduate. But by the time I got there in the fall of 1964, they had done away with the undergraduate program, and my only choice was to take sporadic graduate courses. So I became, out of necessity, an English literature major. And I have to say, I wasn't the most diligent student for two reasons. Number one, football, which consumed my freshman year. I was on an undefeated freshman football team there. And I guess as a freshman, when I was recruited, one of the people who got involved was a journalist who was the sports editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer. And when I was being recruited, he learned about my interest in journalism, and he said something to me that he may have later regretted, which was, if you're ever interested in working at the Inquirer, let me know. Well, the first thing I did when I got to Philadelphia, before going to class, before looking at my fraternity, was to call him up and said, "Hi, do you remember me?" And yes, I'm interested. So starting as a freshman, I was actually a copy boy, I guess you would say, for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And that took probably more of my energy and interest than anything, including academics, including football. I went from football to the rugby team. I realized at one point that I really didn't love football anymore. And I went over to the rugby team, which was a club, not a varsity sport. But the important thing from my point of view was that we were allowed to drink beer on the sidelines. It's something you couldn't do in an Ivy League football game.
Yeah.
So I played rugby for my last 3 years at Penn and worked as a correspondent for the sports section.
Wow.
One of my jobs was to go to games with a staff writer, and at the end of the game, the staff writer would go interview the winning coach, and my job was to go to the loser's locker room and interview the losing coach, which sometimes wasn't the easiest of jobs because they were most often upset and surly and uncommunicative. But that was my job when I worked at the Inquirer, one of my jobs when I worked at the Inquirer.
So you're doing a lot of things, even just outside of school, focusing on the Philadelphia Inquirer.
More so than my academics, I have to say. It's one of the things I regret. One of my greatest regrets is that I did not take advantage of probably one of the finest seats of learning in the Americas, if not the world, the University of Pennsylvania. I skimmed through by the edge of my chinny chin chin academically. Graduated actually 6 months late because I had to take a language course at NYU. And I always subsequently regretted that I didn't take a greater advantage. I mean, I also, to a certain extent, blame the university because they got rid of my curriculum after accepting me, and there were no undergraduate. Well, there might have been an undergraduate course or two, but there was no undergraduate degree in journalism, and that was regrettable.
But even with your time in your undergrad, obviously you were working in Philadelphia, but with news as a whole and how it was being consumed, because what was this in the 60s?
Yeah, it was 64 to 68 were my years in Philadelphia. And I have to say, because of my position with the Inquirer, my first interest was athletics because I was working for the sports department. Occasionally I got an assignment, news breaking on campus, and I would get involved in that. But by and large, I was a sports writer in waiting. And that was really what I hoped to do when I graduated. And actually is what I did when I graduated.
And then I was just curious, with your time in Philadelphia, how was it off campus and the environment in the city?
In the end, I loved the fact that I was in a big city. Took advantage of all the cultural things, particularly rock and roll was just sort of getting discovered in Philadelphia. And a lot of the big acts, the Rolling Stones and others, came through during those days. And I basically went to everything I could possibly go to. So there was that, the advantage of the city. The museums, the professional sports. The boxer Joe Frazier came back from the Olympics and started his professional career when I was there. So I went to see probably his first 10 fights in Philadelphia. So if I had gone to Dartmouth, for example, where I had applied, I wouldn't have had any of the opportunities. I might have been able to go skiing all the time, but being in a big city had advantages.
Yes. And when you graduated, what were you thinking then? Were you thinking of going back to New Jersey or somewhere
I
else?
really had no major plans. I wanted to be a journalist. I thought the best point of entry would be sports because that's what I'd been doing since I was 14 years old in high school. And I applied to a number of places. I remember I had an interview with Sports Illustrated. I had an interview with the Associated Press. And I had an interview with my hometown newspaper where I had worked before I'd gone off to college. And that's where I ended up. I was at the Record for 2 years as a staff writer, the Bergen Record.
And then from what happened after?
Well, during that time period, I got married to Joan Walker, who was in my kindergarten class with me. So we knew each other for a long time by the time we got married. But in the year after we graduated, which was 1968, we got married and moved to Teaneck, New Jersey, and lived for 2 years. Worked for 2 years at the Bergen Record. Joan was teaching during the day. I was working at night, so we didn't really see a lot of each other, and we realized that we didn't like that lifestyle. So I started looking at other opportunities, and up popped an opportunity that tied into my years at Penn. One of my roommates at Penn was Pat Broderick, and his father was Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania, who in 1970, I guess it was running for governor. A lot of my friends don't believe this, but he was actually a Republican. And I worked on his campaign as the assistant press secretary. It was probably one of the worst campaigns in the history of American politics. We did about everything wrong, and he lost in a landslide. But that led to another contact outside of journalism with the fellow who was my boss on the campaign was on leave from Washington. He was the press secretary to U.S. Senator Dick Schweiker from Pennsylvania, who again was a Republican. And when he went back to Washington, he decided he'd had enough of that, and he recommended me for the job of press secretary. Not something I was looking for, not something I thought, but it represented about a 3-time increase in my salary, which for a growing family, by that time our first daughter had been born, was something I had to consider seriously. So starting in 1971 until 1977, I was press secretary to Senator Dick Schweiker from Pennsylvania. The highlight of that tenure, and there were many, he was a moderate Republican, one of the first Republicans to call on Nixon to resign. He was pro-labor, a moderate Republican, the type of which doesn't exist anymore, I think. But I enjoyed that time there, including the 6 months when he was Ronald Reagan's running mate. Not unlike what just happened here. Reagan chose his vice presidential running mate before the convention in an effort to stop the momentum of the Ford candidacy. It didn't work, but for about 6 months, I was involved in a national campaign. It was a very interesting time for me. I always knew, even during those years, as a quasi-politician, although I really thought more of myself as a journalist working for a politician. It was then that I decided that I really wanted to get back into journalism. And I was working temporarily on a small daily paper in Maine, of all places, when I got the call to go to Washington.
Mm. Where in Maine were you working?
I worked on the Kennebec Journal, which is a daily newspaper in Augusta. By that time, again, I was back doing sports, but that was during the time period from the ill-fated gubernatorial campaign and the time that I went to Washington. And it was, that's where I was when I got the call to leave town. And because it was pretty much 3 times the pay that I was getting beforehand, again, as a growing family, I had to seriously consider that.
And moving ahead, was it in 1977, was that the year that you and Joan decided to purchase the Suffolk Times?
When we were working in Washington, and this is after the ill-fated presidential campaign, we decided that we wanted to get back into journalism. It had always been a dream of mine. I had worked very briefly for the Southampton Press and a paper called the Hampton Bays News, and really found that experience very different from when I worked on dailies. And on a daily, you're a specialist and you have one assignment. On a weekly, you get to do about everything. Take photos, write editorials, cover the news. And that's what I had done briefly for a couple of months after my stint on the gubernatorial campaign. And we decided that we wanted to get back into journalism. And we started looking for a community newspaper somewhere between the Carolinas and the maritime provinces of Canada. And we wanted to be about 100 miles, within 100 miles of the coast, someplace where, because we still had family in the Northeast. And that was our goal. We looked at properties in West Virginia, Massachusetts, Virginia, and finally there came available a newspaper company in eastern Long Island where I had spent summers as a kid. I forgot to tell you about that, but when we lived in Hackensack, my parents and grandparents had homes in Amagansett, Long Island, and we used to spend parts of the summer out there. So we knew quite a bit about the East End. Didn't know that much about the North Fork, but I considered myself pretty knowledgeable about the East End in general. And eventually the broker who was doing the search for us came to us and said, would you be interested in looking at something on the North Fork of Long Island? And we jumped at that opportunity. And one thing led to another. The first couple of years were pretty dicey. We were undercapitalized. We really didn't know how to operate a business. So we were winging it for a while. As a matter of fact, I think we probably wouldn't have made it through those first couple of years without a couple of fortuitous things happening. One of them was most unfortunate in that one of the family members who sold the newspaper to us passed away about 6 months after we started business. And by then we were hemorrhaging money, losing money, didn't see how we were going to make it into the future. So we had an opportunity to renegotiate the sale at a rate that was more favorable to us. And in doing so, we entered into a temporary partnership with 2 people we had known in Washington. Howard Simons, who was the managing editor of the Washington Post, was investing in small newspapers around the country. He'd actually bought a paper in Homer, Alaska, just before we got together with him. And he had an associate who was in the Edward Bennett Williams law firm, John Coons, who was also an investor. And we brought them on as minority investors in our company with an understanding that after 5 years, either party could go to the other and say, we want out of this deal. You have to buy us out. And I'm happy to report that within those 5 years, we did manage to turn the company around. It became profitable. It was growing. They decided they weren't interested in the investment anymore. So we were able to buy them out. And from about 82 on, I guess it was, we were independent owners of the newspaper company.
But when you were initially looking throughout the East Coast, there was a lot of local papers at that time. And were there a lot that were for sale?
The answer is yeah. We had plenty of choices. Again, we did on-site visits, I'd say, to at least half a dozen places. I named some of the places, but there were a couple of others, one in Maryland. And either they were too expensive. Again, we were undercapitalized. Joan and her brother, who became a one-third partner for the first couple of years, had a small inheritance. I cashed in my retirement account from the Senate, which was very, very modest. So we just scrambled to get the money together for a down payment. Oh, there was another fortuitous event. I had a college classmate, a fellow by the name of Jim Pappas, who I'm afraid is no longer with us, who was from a very wealthy family in Boston. He was a good friend of mine. And when he heard that we were struggling to make it during that first year, he ended up collateralizing a line of credit for us with the North Fork Bank, which gave us operating capital basically to make it through that first year. And that's also the time period where we took on the minority partners. But it's fair to say that those were touch and go years, and without his interest and generosity, and without the appearance of those two guys from Washington, we probably wouldn't have made it beyond 1 year.
And where was the headquarters? Was it in Greenport?
We were in Greenport originally, right on Main Street, 429 Main Street. And we were there until 1988, so it would have been from 77 to 88. We had tried very, very hard the company had grown. We were maybe 15 employees to begin with. By that time, we were probably at 30, and we just had outgrown the small offices on Main Street. And we made every effort to stay in Greenport. We loved being in Greenport, just the fact of being in a village, of being able to walk anywhere to go get lunch down the street at the Coronet. That was something that we really valued. But unfortunately, we just couldn't find any place that was suitable or that we could afford. So we ended up buying property in Mattituck and building a building there. And from one aspect, that made sense because we were publishers of not just the Suffolk Times, but also the Riverhead News Review. And by moving to Mattituck, we ended up really in the middle of our marketing area. We were close to Riverhead. We were close to the North Fork.
I was also wondering because you said you visited Amagansett even as a child, but when you initially came to the North Fork, what did you think of the area, or even specifically Greenport?
I have to say it was a love affair from first sight. I think we liked everything about the lifestyle here. We had been living in suburban Washington for 6 years, so that was really suburbs. We weren't interested in that. I'm not sure we were interested in being in the mountains someplace, although one of the properties we looked at was in eastern Pennsylvania in a mountainous region. But I don't know, it was just something about the place that we liked. We made very good friends as soon as we got here. The day that we closed on the deal, we met the mayor of Greenport, Joe Townsend, who actually came to our celebratory lunch because he was the nephew of the Dorman family who sold us the paper. And Joe helped us make the transition, meeting people our own age and basically getting used to being in a small town like this. I mean, there were a lot of people who looked at us askance. Who are these kids who are going to take over our local newspaper? I mean, there was a real feeling of ownership among the readers who really depended on the paper, and they really wanted to know a little bit more about us. And I think it took a while before we proved that we were genuine and here to stay. And once that happened, we grew pretty much exponentially. By the time we got to Mattituck office, we were probably coming up on 50 employees, not all of them full-time. I think at the height, including stringers and that sort of thing, there were probably 75 people on the payroll. So we'd gotten
From
pretty big.
14 or 15
From 14 or 15. I mean, that was more than 10 years in happening.
Yes.
Also, during that next couple of years, we ended up buying the Shelter Island reporter, and also starting a newspaper up on the North Shore as you get close to Port Jefferson. So we were running 4 newspapers at one time, and therefore the staff had gotten much bigger.
Yes. But before you moved to Mattituck, you mentioned some of the financial problems that you overcame early on. But within the journalistic part of the job, what were you focusing on or implementing, say, when you, at least specifically for the Suffolk Times, with stories that you might have covered in those first 10 years, and were there any layout changes and other things?
Well, I think there were some unwritten rules that affected the Suffolk Times and also the Traveler Watchman, which was a competitor of ours based in Southold. There, with the Traveler, for example, they had a long-time policy of whenever they took a photograph of the candidates for office, they would put the Democrats on the far end of the photograph and then cut them out because they didn't want to be supporting or publicizing any Democrats. So the papers here had a reputation of being pretty partisan, and we wanted to bring an end to that for sure. We just basically, by virtue of what we covered, what we said in our editorial pages, wanted to prove that we were going to be independent and we would follow a story no matter where it went. And it took a while for that to be accepted in the community. There was some resentment because we did endorse some Democrats. I remember being in hot water with the Republican Party. I got called into the office of the then Republican supervisor, Al Martosha, and he wanted to let me know that was sort of unprecedented. And, I listened to him, but we went back to doing what we thought was right, which was covering a story no matter where it led. And I think those things changed the perception of the paper and helped in our growth over the years.
And when you took on the role, did you continue to work on stories, or were you focused more on the administration?
Joan and I split our duties. We were co-publishers, and I think for a while I carried the title of editor of the Suffolk Times. But we each had our own responsibilities, and I have to say that we worked very well together. That was her domain, payroll, salary, banking, that sort of thing, and she did an excellent job of it. Without really any training in that field, she felt her way as we went. And I was more in charge of the sales and editorial side. And over those years, we had some really, really good editors who came to take more and more of the responsibility. Jeff Miller, Sue Miller, his wife, Tim Gould, and eventually others came in and replaced my role as an editor. I still was involved in the process, but not in the day-to-day operations.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that you had purchased the Shelter Island Reporter, and you already had, when you purchased the Suffolk Times, that included Riverhead.
There were the 2 papers originally. Then the transition to the Reporter was interesting in that when we were first in Greenport, because Shelter Island was covering the North Fork and Shelter Island, I went to the publisher then and said, if you're ever interested in selling, please talk to us because we're in the same area. He took ill. His name is Bob Dunn. He took ill a couple years later and came to me and said, we'd like to talk to you about selling. We had an agreement of sale, and then his health took a turn for the worst and he passed away. And his widow, who had not been involved in day-to-day operations at the Reporter, came back and said that she was not interested in selling. And a couple years later, there was a major snafu. I won't try to get into it because it's too detailed, but basically which pitted the staff against the then publisher and the editor. And the staff basically decided that they wanted to work for them no longer. And they came to us and said, would you be interested in publishing the Shelter Island Reporter if we come with the deal? And we said, well, we were interested 10 years ago when the publisher said he wanted to sell to us. So the answer is yes. So sort of against the wishes of the then publisher and editor, we came on as owners. And that was probably in the early 90s, something like that. And also sometime during that time period, we started the fourth paper, the North Shore Sun, which was based basically Riverhead and west towards, I guess Port Jefferson was the far western territory.
And you had built up a bigger staff to kind of navigate multiple areas.
Well, we were at that point we had 4 offices.
Not just the one in Mattituck.
Not just Mattituck. And we had one in Riverhead. We had one on Shelter Island, and we had one up in, I think it was Rocky Point. And I think after a while we realized that was pretty inefficient, and we started consolidating operations in Mattituck. And we continued doing that through the years that Joan and I were involved. We've been out of the day-to-day ops, out of the business pretty much entirely for about 10 years now. But by the time we left, we'd cut down the size of the staff and also the number of offices. As a matter of fact, about 2 years ago now, Joan and I own the property where the Suffolk Times was based. And about 2 years ago, we sold that property. It's now an indoor golf range of all things. And the staff moved a couple doors away to a neighboring office complex. And that's where they're based now.
Now, could you share any memorable stories or moments, more so memorable stories that the Suffolk Times covered and played a significant role?
I remember a memorable incident and then some memorable stories. The incident was, I guess it was in the late 70s, might have been 78, 79. We lived in Orient, where we still live. We got a phone call at about 3 o'clock in the morning, and there was a strange voice on the end of the line, and it was a man, and he said to me, "There's a fire at Mitchell's." And Mitchell's was a very famous restaurant and marina downtown. It's where Mitchell Park is now.
Yes.
And I said, "Thank you." I grabbed my camera, got in the car, drove to Mitchell's. And when I got there, there was no sign of the fire department. There were signs of a fire, flames and smoke. And they got there a couple minutes after I got there. And I always theorized that whoever called me also knew how the fire started, that they were complicit in that. The business and the restaurant were destroyed. We tried to follow up on that, but nothing ever came of it. To this day, it's a mystery as to what happened.
Wow.
The 2 stories that stick in my mind, because I was personally involved in them, one of them was the Robert Waterhouse story. Robert Waterhouse was I think a 16-year-old boy who was convicted of murdering a woman here in Greenport who he had done some yard work for. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison and then paroled, I think largely because of his age. Again, he was 17-year-old when the crime was committed. He then knocked around the country a little bit, ended up in Florida, and he did it again. He murdered another woman and was this time sentenced to death. And that was in the early 80s. And I began a sort of a pen pal relationship with him, covering that story. Went to visit him in prison in Stark, Florida at some point over the years. And we continued to cover the story. He ended up being the longest serving inmate on death row in Florida when he was finally executed, which was now probably 10 to 15 years ago. But I was invited by him to go to the execution, which is not something I relish, but I felt since I'd been covering the story from its inception. Although we did not live here at the time of the first murder. Again, we came here probably 6 or 7 years after he was first convicted of murder.
How was it going down there and talking to him and trying to get the story?
Yeah, we developed, I guess what you'd say, is a pen pal relationship. He was not a stupid person. He had intelligence. He was articulate. He wrote letters to me on a fairly regular basis. But it was also clear to me that he was deeply flawed. And there was an element of that I think made him, at least in some respects, a pitiful character. And that is, when he was a child, I think probably 6 or 7, his parents traded him to his aunt and uncle for a dining room set. They didn't want him as their son. He was rejected by his birth parents, ended up living with his aunt and uncle until he left town. So if he was angry, I sort of understand how that might have happened. I'm not saying what he did was justified. He was a heinous murderer. I happen to believe that there are times when the death penalty is warranted, and I felt in his case he did it twice. I think if he'd gotten out, he might have done it thrice. So
Yeah.
So that was one story. The other one involved an individual by the name of William or Bill Lamort, who moved to town with a great flourish. I guess it was probably the early 80s. He bought a very large mansion on the water in Southold. He bought or started 2 or 3 food markets. One of them in Cutchogue, and became sort of the darling of the community. He threw a lot of money all over the place. He became good friends with influential people. He supported the PBA events financially and that sort of thing. All the while, he was a major importer of drugs, which nobody knew, at least apparently nobody knew, for quite a few years. He was eventually charged with being an importer to the point where he used to bring large tanker ships to the shores of his house in Southold and unload hundreds, if not thousands, of pounds of marijuana and that sort of thing. And he was eventually arrested, charged, convicted, and received what now, today, would be considered an unusually harsh sentence of, I think, 50 years with no opportunity for parole. And once again, I had developed a sort of correspondence with him in covering the story. And he invited me to come to his prison out in Pennsylvania, which I did. He was a transformed man. I mean, he was always very easygoing and soft-spoken. You would never consider him to be a major drug lord, except that he was. And I went out to visit him, and he was very regretful, not very bitter. I think he accepted his fate. But a couple years later, surprisingly, he died of a heart attack while in prison. So those were 2 stories that I sort of followed from the inception. They were not representative of the coverage that we did. Most of the coverage we did was very routine by comparison. But those were 2 stories that stood out in my mind and 2 stories that I was personally involved in.
So those were 2 stories that were on the North Fork but affected a broader area, and that the 2 of them were dispersed.
I used to have a saying that if there's an earthquake and Mrs. Slajewski's plates in East Hampton are broken in the process, we're not going to cover that story because it's not our area. We were intensely local. The reason we existed was to cover the communities where we served. So it would be only tangentially that we would be interested in the story that didn't directly affect or be situated in our area of interest. Occasionally, the News Review in Riverhead and the Suffolk Times in Southold would cover and carry a regional story. The same but the editorial content most weeks was very, very distinctly separate. And I think that was one of the reasons why we succeeded and others did not. When we first came here, there were probably 7 or 8 publications that covered our neck of the woods, at least marginally. By the time we left, there was only 3 standing, and they were our 3 papers, Shelter Island, Riverhead, and Southold. So I think our decision to be intensely local and only be concerned if it affected our readership ended up being a good business decision.
Because there wasn't any, those other papers had either, with Shelter Island Reporter you had bought, but the other ones just ceased to exist.
They went away over time.
Yeah.
They didn't have the reader support or the circulation to be financially viable. I mean, it wasn't our intention to put our competitors out of business, but from our perspective, it was better that it was them and not us.
There wasn't any, in terms further west, say with Newsday, there wasn't really a competition.
Never really had a problem with Newsday. I mean, every now and then they would be interested in a story in our neck of the woods, and every now and then they would beat us on a story. They would get there first. They had a much larger editorial staff. We were smart enough over the years to hire away one of their best editor, Steve Wick, who just retired this past year. Steve is an outstanding journalist who realized that the commute to wherever Newsday was based was more than he wanted to handle. He liked the idea of coming to Mattituck to work and did some outstanding work for us over the years. But Newsday was never a major competitor when it came to news or advertising.
And would you say from 77 into the 90s and early 2000s, what you might call the locals that initially were maybe hesitant or not sure how, you mentioned that they weren't sure how you would.
It took a while for us to be accepted, but I think if you're talking by the year 2000, I think we were definitely accepted in all 3 communities that we were covering.
Yes.
We never really made a foothold up on the North Shore. There was a lot more competition up there. There were a lot more weeklies, a couple of them very good weeklies. So when we went into Rocky Point in that area, I'm not saying it was ill-advised, but we never had the kind of market penetration that we had in the other communities.
And also in this time frame, how did you navigate the transition from more of the traditional print to the digital media during your time as publisher?
Well, we started out, number one, as an old-fashioned letterpress operation using old equipment.
That
and
was still in the building in Greenport.
Yeah, that was really phasing out by the time we got there. But it was done the old-fashioned way with typewriters and typesetting equipment. And somewhere along the line, we heard about this thing called a Macintosh computer. And we were looking at trying to set up an electronic publishing system where the reporter would type a story and it would automatically be ready to be set in type. But whenever we looked around, the cost of those systems were hundreds of thousands of dollars, and we simply couldn't afford it. And then Apple invented the Macintosh computer, which was maybe a couple of $1,000s then. And that's how we made the transition to electronic publishing. And over the years, we relied more and more on the technology. And somewhere along the line, we decided to expand with lifestyle publications. We had a publication that was distributed on the ferry over to New London. We created a publication called Wine Press, which still exists. More recently, they created something called the North Forker, which is a lifestyle magazine. And those changes helped us more and more to make the change from an old-fashioned printed newspaper to an electronic newspaper. And I'd say now, I don't know the exact breakdown, but it's probably more of a 50-50 operation where half of the volume comes through publication electronically, and the other half through the old-fashioned newsprint. Have to give our son-in-law Andrew Olson and our daughter Sarah Olson, who are now the owners. We transitioned to their ownership. I guess it was now almost 15 years ago they've been doing it. But they've ridden the crest of that technological change and done it very well. The publications that they produce online, or even those four-color publications, glossy publications that are distributed the old-fashioned way, they've done a remarkable job of realizing that times are changing. And I do see a day in the probably not too distant future where the print version of the publications may go away. It makes me very sad to think about. When I think about starting in this business when I was 14 years old, the daily newspaper, to today, when it's harder and harder to get people to actually pick up a physical copy of the paper. I'm a troglodyte when it comes to that. I can't begin my day with holding the New York Times in my hands and reading the stories. And then if I have to go look at it online later. But again, I'm a dying breed, and I understand that things have changed, and I'm happy to say that the Olsons, who are now the owners of the newspapers, understand that difference.
But towards the end of your ownership, that time, I think the physical papers were still going very strong. I think there was that starting to be a transition to where you could pay to read it online. And like you said, I think that's more now with Andrew Olson.
Yeah, I think it's also a generational thing.
Yeah.
I'm 78 years old, and I started, again, printing the little Coolidge Place Gazette on a piece of paper. So I've always thought of it that way. But the younger people, and that would include the Olsons, who are now the owners, started getting their news and information online, many, many years ago. So they understand the importance of being able to make that transition. I'd like to think that there'll always be a print version of the newspapers, but I'm not so naive to know that for sure. I mean, I think the trend,
so.
Yeah, I would hope so too, but at this point, it looks to me like it's more a hope than anything else. Because I think people, the younger generation, and our daughter and her husband are in their 50s, but the people who are now in their, teens and 20s and 30s, they don't know anything about a print publication. Mm-hmm. They get their news and information electronically. So we have to understand that that's where things are headed. And I would not be surprised if at some point in the distant future, print goes away.
But now we're seeing, I don't know about on Long Island, but there's still a lot of local newspapers on Long Island. But a lot of other places throughout the country, there's been a lot of local papers that have had to shut down. And now those small communities just get the regular Associated Press or some larger news outlets that's all they can rely on, and they don't get any stories from local papers anymore.
That's certainly the case in, I'd say, most of America. Mm-hmm. New York State is sort of a hotbed for community newspapers. We have been very involved with the New York Press Association, which is a trade group for community weeklies, paid circulation. My predecessor as publisher, Stuart Dorman, was the president of the NYPA. I was the president of the NYPA. Andrew Olson was the president of the NYPA. So we're very, very close to them. And I'd say New York is unusual compared to a lot of other places in terms of the strengths of its community newspapers. Mm-hmm. And mentioning the NYPA reminds me, when we spoke earlier, you asked me if there was anything that I was particularly proud of. And in 1995, the Suffolk Times was judged to be the best weekly newspaper in its circulation category by the National Newspaper Association. That was a nationwide honor, and we were always very proud of that. with the NYPA, many, many years, I would say dozens of years, our papers were chosen to be the best in their circulation category in New York State. It probably happened 20 times over the years that we were there. So we got that recognition, and we appreciated it.
No, that's wonderful. And then also with your role in the administration, what was your approach to building and leading a strong team at the Suffolk Times?
Well, we always went and tried to find the best possible candidates. If it involved being an editor and reporter, we actually put them to the test initially and asked them to cover a story or write a couple stories and evaluate them that way. I guess because we're close enough to New York City, there never seemed to be a shortage of people who had experience in communications, not necessarily weekly newspapers, but coming out of the city very often. People, not our editors so much. Our editors, I think, were mostly homegrown, but other members of the editorial staff came out of publishing in the city or having worked at other newspapers. I remember hiring a reporter named Tim Wacker, whose parents actually both worked for Newsday, and I evaluated him by looking at the newspaper he was working on, and I forget where it was, but I think it was in Massachusetts. And I picked up a copy of the paper, and his byline appeared on 10 stories that week. He was amazingly prolific, and they were good stories. They were well written, to the point, and he just jumped off the page as somebody we would be interested in. Fortunately, he had a local connection. His parents lived here, and we hired him as fast as we could. But I'm happy to say that we never had a shortage of qualified candidates. It's become a challenge now, in part because of the cost of housing. We need to pay reporters enough to be able to live out here. But what do? Do you buy $1 million house? No, you try to find an affordable apartment. And as we all know, that's increasingly difficult. Nowadays, more and more of the staff members of the party, of the paper, live a little bit farther to the west in Brookhaven town.
They have to commute.
And have to commute to work because they can't afford to live here.
Yeah.
I wish there was something the newspaper, could do to build an apartment house just for reporters, but it's really necessary. It's a problem. Cost of housing is a challenge for those people.
Yes. And I also was curious about your thoughts on, in terms of the way news is consumed today. It's obviously changing, but even more so, we might get more people there might be more misinformation coming out, that people are getting stories from unreliable sources and through social media and other outlets. That wasn't something that was really journalists had to deal with as much back then, because everyone had just the newspaper, and now with the computer and all these things, we're getting a lot of unreliable.
I think the social media component affects our end of the business more than anything else.
Yeah.
It's not that our readers are getting bad information from other publications. Again, we're really the only ones who cover these markets week in and week out. But social media is a challenge, because very often there are scurrilous or uninformed things that are going up online that we eventually have to deal with, and that's a real challenge. I'm glad I got out of the business soon enough that that's not something I've got to worry about every day, but I think our editors and staff members have to keep an eye out for that, because a lot of misinformation flies around the web, as you well know.
Mm-hmm. And also, on a national level, what do you think about some of the larger news papers or news outlets? How do you think those companies have changed? Because even, say, like the Washington Post is now owned by Jeff Bezos, and you're getting more, there's more control within the hands of a few people that are controlling what they will provide with the news, and just with CNN and some of these other ones compared to even what you saw, say, in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, that's true. Although I have to say, our end of the business, other than the scurrilous stuff that ends up on the web, is not affected the way the New York Times is, for example. They're delivering half of their product electronically now. So they have to keep an eye out for that problem a lot more than we do. But there's no doubt that it's changing. I got to say, the New York Times has done a pretty good job of making the transition and turning print customers into web customers. But for every New York Times, there are probably half a dozen papers out in Middle America that haven't been able to make that transition. So it's a never-ending challenge. And there's a lot of misinformation out there, no doubt about it.
And do you think there's a lot of the, even on Long Island, do you think a lot of the news outlets are still providing the news in a bipartisan way and not being biased?
I'm not really in a position to judge what's happening on the rest of Long Island because I just haven't been following other publications.
Yeah.
My two sources of news are the New York Times and the Suffolk Times. And if it's not there, or maybe on the 6 o'clock news, I'm just going to be uninformed on the subject. I often have to go to my wife, Joan, and say, honey, what's happening? Is there something going on that I need to be aware of? Because she's much more diligent in keeping track of that sort of a thing. If it's not in one of the Timeses, New York or Suffolk, then I'm unlikely to be well informed on the subject.
Well, and then there's so much news coming out, even every few hours. It's hard to keep up with the changing news.
It's fair to say, even though I just disavowed getting much information, I do get bulletins on my cell phone, my iPhone, constantly during the day.
Yes.
So at the very least, I'll see the headlines.
Yes.
I probably won't pursue them once again. Once Joan is determined that it's worthwhile, then I'll weigh in. But it's a never-ending barrage. I'm sure in the hour that you and I have been talking together, I've received at least half a dozen must-see bulletins. Yes. I'm not so sure they're must-see, but there's an overload of news and information for sure.
And you mentioned some of the accomplishments with your time at the Suffolk Times. I was curious what obviously you've given it over to your daughter and son-in-law, but
they are now 100% owners of the newspaper company.
But I just wanted your thoughts on what you hope for the future of the Suffolk Times and its role in the community. What would you hope to continue to see?
Well, whether it's being delivered by a news truck as a piece of paper or coming to you via your high-tech wristwatch, it doesn't really matter to me, in part because I have no control over that, how the product is delivered. But I'd like to think that whether it's technology or just good old elbow grease, tracking down a good local story, that there'll always be a place for it. The way it's delivered is changing and will change profoundly in the next generation, I think, or maybe even less time than that. But I'd like to think that there's always going to be a place, regardless of how that news, information, and opinion is delivered.
And separate from journalism, I just had two questions more about just with your time on the North Fork. Since being out here since the 70s, obviously things have changed, and Greenport has changed with Mitchell Park, and you've mentioned the housing, but is there any specific thing that you miss about the way the North Fork used to be?
Not really.
No.
I have friends, neighbors who are complain all the time about the changes, and there's a new house on this lot, and it was always empty. I feel like the pace of change has been appropriate, and in generally well managed. Something I forgot to talk about earlier, Joan and I once went to Nantucket and admired all the open space there and did some investigating and found out there was something called the Community Preservation Fund, where public funds were being used to keep open space. And we came back here and started writing about that in the paper, saying that's something that we should take a look at on Eastern Long Island, particularly the 5 East End towns. And I have to say, originally, there was a tremendous amount of negative feedback about that, particularly from the real estate industry. I remember there was a realtor, also highly placed Republican town councilman, John Nichols, who came to me and said, you're going to put my business out of business if you keep talking about preserving this open space. Well, the reality is that 10 years after we started talking about it, and I'm very proud that we were among the first to start talking about it, that became a reality. And one of the reasons this place is still one of the best places to live in America, in my opinion, is because we have saved so much open space by using public funds. That was a great thing that happened. So even though there's been change, I don't feel like the pace of change has been too fast. I still look at the little village of Orient that we moved into in 1977 and realize it's a very, very special place. And that's true of the entire North Fork. So I'm happy with the pace of change. I don't think it's too fast.
Yes. It's almost that we've been able to preserve a lot of the land, and there has been a lot of progress in the area, especially in Greenport. I think now it's just trying to balance or figuring out the housing and keeping people working out here and not just it being a tourist destination in the summer.
Certainly our elected representatives need to really concentrate on that issue. But I think, every now and then there's a moratorium of a year or two. That slows down the change, and I'm okay with that too, because that gives us time to make a informed decision about where we're headed.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, I'd say our elected representatives have done a pretty good job of keeping track of the pace of growth. The growth has been noticeable, significant, but not bad.
And
I'd just like to add one thing.
Sure.
We have 2 grandchildren who grew up here, went to Mattituck High School, off to good colleges. I'm hoping they hear this. If they ever decide to get involved in the family business, and I'm not saying that they've shown any interest so far, but that would make me very happy. Their parents are now running the paper, but if a third generation of our family were to stay involved, that would be a very good thing from my perspective.
Yes. It would be great to see it continue in the...
It gets to be harder and harder to do that
Yes.
nowadays. And again, their interest may not lie in this direction whatsoever.
Yes.
But secretly to myself, no longer a secret, that would make me happy.
Yes. But yeah, was there anything else you'd like to say or discuss that we haven't?
I think we pretty much have covered it. I appreciate talking to you. You obviously had done quite a bit of research before getting in touch, so yes. I appreciate that hard work.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast and share your story and the wonderful journey that you've taken with journalism and keeping the Suffolk Times going through that whole period and onto your family. So
I feel very blessed that I've been able to realize that lifelong dream that began on Coolidge Place and is continuing through our family.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 82 with Troy Gustavson. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.